I'll talk to you. No, it's okay. I'll talk to you later. All right, thank you. Okay, I got it. Sorry, so sorry about that.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay.
It's always the technology.
I know. Gosh, I break like every single laptop and everything too. I was like worried I would make my laptop freeze. But so to start, basically, I guess I'll just give you a little background on what the class we're in is, and then
I've heard Dr. Crosby Watson talk about this curriculum that she's developed, so I'm somewhat familiar with it.
Yeah, it's really, really like up to date. It's the first class I think I've ever taken where we're like really up to date on like every single form of like research and like therapy for a disease. It's really interesting because like normally like when I take like a bio class, it's like a few years behind. But
At least, yeah.
yeah, at least. So I really enjoy it. But basically, we have a project called a media assignment where we have to record like a little video or something about DMD research from any aspect. A lot of what we've been doing is learning about therapies, but we have been starting to learn a little bit about like funding and stuff like that. But I was hoping that maybe you could prove like a good source of background information. So,
Sure.
so if you, I'll just get started, I guess. If you could possibly give me like your name and a little bit of your background, that would be amazing.
Okay. So thanks for sending the questions in advance. I looked over the questions. I think let's not spend too much time on the first couple of questions.
Okay.
I think the down towards the end there's more interesting stuff. So
Okay,
I
great.
can spend like a little bit more time talking about what a program director does and a little less time about how I happened to get here. So,
Okay, perfect.
So I'm Glenn Knuckles. I'm the program director for the muscular dystrophies and peripheral neuropathies at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. So that's a mouthful. So that's a part of NIH. So a little bit about NIH. NIH is actually 27 different institutes and centers. So there's like the National Cancer Institute, the National Eye Institute. So many of them are kind of focused on certain body parts or organ systems and so forth. So I've been with neurological disorders and stroke for almost 2 years now. And before that, I was 10 years in the extramural program of the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. And it's those two institutes that fund the majority of muscular dystrophy research at NIH. There are some other players, so Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and Child Health and Human Development. They also participate in funding of the muscular dystrophies, but it's NIAMS and NINDS are the two major ones. So each of the institutes at NIH, they do kind of two things. One is the intramural program, which is people who do research, on the NIH campus in Bethesda. And that's actually, for most institutes, somewhere around 10 to 15% of their overall budget. And the majority of the budget goes to the extramural program, which I'm part of. And so we make awards for research grants all across the country and to some foreign countries as well. So in the muscular dystrophies, we cover Duchenne muscular dystrophy and a variety of other forms of muscular dystrophy. So you may be familiar, there's about 35 different types of muscular dystrophies. So we have research on kind of a wide range of them. But certainly Duchenne gets a large chunk of it. So I went and looked up the numbers. This is for fiscal year 2015. The NIH overall budget for the muscular dystrophies was $77 million. And $30 million of that is just for Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Oh, wow. And why do you think Duchenne ends up getting more funding than the other muscular dystrophies?
Well, so keep in mind that the way the NIH works, we don't have set aside amounts of funding for different disease areas. That's not how we work.
Yeah.
For the most part, the AIDS and some other areas do have more kind of a designated, but for most areas, and dystrophies are included, it all depends on the number of applications that we get during a year and how successful those applications are in peer review. So the majority of our funding is made with what we call a pay line. So we determine how much budget we have to fund research during the year, and historically we determine about what score of application we can afford to fund. And so anything better than that score just gets funded. And then there's a little bit of gray zone just beyond that that we talk about and kind of pick and choose depending on, programmatic issues of, do we already have things like this? Is this a new up and coming area? Is it really innovative? Did it get very good significant scores? Is it an investigator that we really need to do something for? Things like that. But for the most part, it's determined by number of applications and quality of the applications. And, we just get more Duchenne applications than other disease areas, other muscular dystrophies right now. And part of that's because of what's going on in the Duchenne field. So the Duchenne field is, maybe 6 to 10 years, maybe 6 or 8 years ahead of the other muscular dystrophies in getting to clinical trials that are applying for approval. So there have been 2 Duchenne drugs in the past year that have had what are called FDA advisory committee meetings to consider whether the drugs are approved. And I had the pleasure of serving on both of those advisory committees, so that was really kind of interesting. But the other muscular dystrophies, like myotonic dystrophy, is doing some clinical trials, and there's, I think, one trial in FSH, which is facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy. But really, a lot of things are going on in Duchenne right now.
Yeah. And then you talked a bit about the integration of various therapies. How does the MD Care Act work in terms of? I decided to look it up a little.
Good.
And if you could just possibly tell me what does it stand for and how it helps different institutions sort of integrate their research.
Yeah. So it's the Muscular Dystrophy Community Assistance Research and Education Act, and it was first passed by Congress. So it's federal law. It was first passed by Congress in, I think it was 2001, and it was really the advocacy groups in the muscular dystrophies that got together and talked to their congresspeople and put it forward and got a lot of support for it. And it's done a number of things, some of them for NIH and some of them for kind of other parts of the government. For the NIH, it specified, number one, that we create centers of excellence, which are research centers that in one of the, so the MD Care Act was first in 2001, then renewed in 2008, and then again in 2014. And somewhere in there, the Centers of Excellence were changed to be called the Senator Paul Wellstone Muscular Dystrophy Cooperative Research Centers. And Senator Wellstone from Minnesota was one of the original, leaders in getting the MD Care Act passed. So NIH funds 6 of these Wellstone centers, and each center gets about $1.5 million in funding per year. So some of the centers are just at one institution. So like Kevin Campbell has one at University of Iowa, and pretty much all the people who work on it are there. And then some of the centers have researchers at various different universities. So let's see, Melissa Spencer, who you may know, she's at UCLA. She's part of Lee Sweeney's Wellstone Center, and he's at the University of Florida, and he has other investigators kind of spread around the country. So it created Wellstone Centers, and I've been kind of the NIH coordinator of the Wellstone Centers program for about 10 years or so. And then it also created an organization called the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee, the MDCC. And the MDCC is stakeholders in muscular dystrophy research. So it's 4 of the NIH institutes that I mentioned earlier, and it's the FDA and the CDC, and actually Department of Defense has a Duchenne muscular dystrophy program, and Social Security Administration and Agency for Community Living. So a bunch of federal agencies, and then there are 5 patient advocacy groups that are also represented. And from the Duchenne area, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy is
Mm-hmm.
is one of the big. It's not the only, but it's one of the big advocacy groups. So I'm the designated federal official for the Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee. So we meet twice a year here in Bethesda, and basically just discuss issues related to promoting research in the muscular dystrophies. And I think it's particularly a good organization that we have the federal stakeholders and the voluntary groups. So we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and people from the Social Security Administration came in and were talking about how people qualify for disability benefits. And the advocacy groups were really interested in the fine details of how this works, and they wanted to get more information from the Social Security Administration to put on their websites to help families with muscular dystrophy be able to more easily get access to services.
Mm-hmm.
So we do a lot of things like that. So MD Care Act also, it just kind of encouraged NIH to intensify the research that we do on the muscular dystrophies, and then it had some specific activities for the CDC and some other federal agencies. So those are kind of the main things that MD Care Act did, and yeah. And so we have to report back to Congress regularly on what's going on.
How often do you have to report back?
Well, so we get congressional language usually once a year with appropriations discussion that we need to report back.
Mm-hmm. And then on a different angle, what is the process of applying for a grant? And on average, I guess we already talked about a little bit how much funding was available. But what is the process for a university to apply?
So let me tell you a little bit more about what a program director does, and that'll help you understand. So when I first moved out of the intramural program at NIAMS and into extramural, for about a year I was a review officer. And so that was really a good way to learn how the grants program works. And that's the front end of NIH. We were all about peer review. So as a program director, what my role is to talk with people who are interested in getting support from NIH and to guide them into what type of grant to apply for, make sure that they understand, the policy that goes with it, stuff like that. And then they submit the grant application, and then it goes to peer review. And for peer review, it's the review officer that selects the reviewers and conducts the meeting and makes sure that that's all done according to policy. And I can go in and observe that, but I'm not in any way involved in the peer review. But after peer review, a grant application gets what's called a summary statement. And the summary statement includes critiques from usually 3, sometimes more, of the reviewers that were assigned to review that application, as well as the scores are on the summary statement. So the applicant contacts me if they want to get more insight or talk about what's in the critiques, because I've been there at the meeting. I've heard what was said, and I look at a lot of summary statements, so I can kind of help them understand what the reviewers meant and what might be necessary to address the concerns. So then I also participate in funding decisions. So as I mentioned, most funding decisions are just according to pay line, but there's some other things that, like really big grants and things that are just beyond the pay line, that sometimes program directors get an opportunity to make a difference and to help get somebody funded. And then after the grant is awarded, so then we have to check through some policy things before we make a grant award. After the grant is awarded, the investigator needs to put in progress reports once a year, and so I read the progress reports and just make sure that things are going as usual. And then so that's all kind of process driven for a program director. But the fun part is when we get to be a little more creative. So one of our roles is to kind of watch what's going on in a research field and look out for, obstacles that we could address in some way, or scientific opportunities that need to be promoted to try and accelerate progress in that research field. And so sometimes we get to write what are called funding opportunity announcements that says, here, apply for this special kind of grant, and we've got money to go with it, or we've got a special review or something like that. And that's really exciting, because then, we get to have an impact and create something that way. Yeah. So one of the things that I've been involved in recently, and I think with some of the other questions, I'll get into this maybe a little bit more. I think what the muscular dystrophy field and other rare disease fields need at this time is, certainly work on developing therapies, drugs and biologics. But at the same time, and actually probably before that, we need really good clinical research tools. We need what are called outcome measures for use in clinical trials. We need biomarkers. So these are the tools that let you accurately and efficiently determine whether that drug is actually working in a set of patients. So you can imagine, if the outcome measure has too much variability in it, then statistically you'll need many, many more patients, or you'll have to follow the patients for a longer period of time in order to be able to see a difference. But if the outcome measure is very accurate, then it can reduce the time and length of time to do a clinical trial. And it could make the difference of, not tossing out a drug saying it didn't work, where maybe it did actually work. And this has been a problem for the muscular dystrophy field for a while, that the outcome measures that we have are somewhat limited. So one initiative that I had the opportunity to work with a bunch of program directors at NINDS to develop recently is for clinical trial readiness for rare neurological and neuromuscular diseases. So we're accepting applications twice a year, specifically for these clinical research tools that are needed for upcoming clinical trials. So it's kind of bang for the buck. It gets us perhaps investment in developing the tools, making a difference in the quality of clinical trials. So clinical trials, very, very expensive. So, you really want to avoid having an inconclusive clinical trial, although that happens all the time. So we want to improve the quality of those clinical trials. So that's kind of, some of the creative things that program directors get to do.
So another question, actually going off that, it wasn't on the list, is a lot of what we've talked about in our class as an outcome measure has been the 6-minute walk test.
Yes. Yeah.
Have you guys come up with sort of an alternative to that for future research? Because I've seen a lot of
right.
Argument over the validity of that as an outcome measure.
Right. So, and I'm sure you had discussions about what all goes into the 6-minute walk test. That it's certainly measuring muscle function, but it's also measuring kind of motivation of the subject and training and all that kind of stuff. So I think that clinical trials in the dystrophies will continue to use those kinds of functional measurements. So I don't know if you talked about the North Star assessment. It's a composite measure of things like it's got a 10-meter walk, and then its ability to rise from the floor and do other kind of physical activities. I think it's good, and I think we'll see it used more and more in clinical trials. Excuse me. One of the things that I've been involved in a little bit that I think is going very well is the use of magnetic resonance imaging and spectroscopy, so MRI, to look at muscle, and it can give a measure of the composition and in some ways the function of muscle. So when I was at NIAMS, I knew that there were a couple of different groups that were interested in exploring the use of MRI in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they were groups that I'm not sure that they were talking to each other. And so we brought them all together to NIH, and we had a day-long meeting. And we talked about if you really wanted to make a clinical study for MRI and Duchenne, what would it look like? What would you measure? How many people you're going to need? What age groups? A lot of the kind of details of that. And so, and then part of that group went off and designed an application and came back, and it went through peer review and it got funded. And it's called Imaging DMD, and it's a study that's led by Krista Vanderborn at the University of Florida. And they also have Children's Hospital Philadelphia and Oregon Health Sciences involved in it. And it's a study of 100 boys with Duchenne and 50 age-matched controls. And at first it followed their lower limbs, and they've published some really impressive papers about the quality of the images and the information that you can get out of it. So one of the outcome measures, it's actually a biomarker when it's an imaging type thing. The biomarker that they've refined is called fat fraction. So it's it's a measure of the amount of lipid that's accumulated in the skeletal muscle. And they've shown that changes more rapidly than like loss of strength. So you can measure changes in fat fraction over just a couple of months, and it may take 6 months or a year to actually measure changes in strength and functional ability in Duchenne boys. So that's, no motivation required, just, get them to stay in the magnet and get imaging. So that is, so they just got a renewal of that grant for 5 more years, and they're now looking at upper limb as well as lower limb. And there are several clinical trials run by companies that are including MR biomarkers designed from that study in their clinical trials. And in fact, I think there's one clinical trial that is in an early stage clinical trial, and magnetic resonance imaging is their primary outcome measure. So,
do you think that could end up replacing? We talked a lot about in our class using skeletal muscle biopsies or using like immunohistochemistry. Do you think it could replace that as a method?
Well, so muscle biopsies that I'm sure you discussed, there's a sampling error for that. You get a tiny little bit of tissue. So MRI has the advantage to look at the whole muscle. But there's certain things that, at least currently, you can get from a biopsy that you can't get from MR. So, quantifying dystrophin production, there's no marker in MR for specific proteins. So, but certainly for kind of routine diagnosis and for monitoring total muscle over time, I think that MRI is going to become used more and more. It may not completely replace muscle biopsies, especially for interventions that are designed to change the level of accumulation of specific proteins, since that can't be measured by MRI. But yeah, I think that's one of the changes that we're going to see in the field.
Okay. And then in terms of finding sort of a therapy or a cure, do you have any therapies that you personally find most promising? Or?
So, in my position, I can't pick favorites. So I have grantees that cover a lot of different types of candidate therapeutics for the muscular dystrophies. And, I think they're all quite exciting and promising. So, the list that you had, I'd add drugs that are aimed at either anti-inflammation or anti-fibrosis, and gene transfer, cell transfer. So, there are really a lot of different things going on in the muscular dystrophy field. And it's been really exciting in the time that I've been involved to see such an explosion of different approaches as potential therapies for the muscular dystrophies. And even though I'm not doing the research myself, I know that I'll be get a lot of satisfaction when it changes clinical practice, and I think I'm hoping that will happen soon. So one of the kind of trends in the muscular dystrophies, and I think it's seen really in any disease area, is the concept that none of these therapies are going to be a cure, and we try to avoid the term cure. That in reality, it's likely to have some positive effect and be approved, and then it'll be additional clinical trials to see if there's synergy, at least additiveness or synergy among different potential treatments. So, for example, in the future, we may see an exon skipping drug combined with a myostatin inhibitor or an anti-inflammatory and something else, dystrophin upregulation. There could be a variety of combinations, and that's what I think other disease fields have seen. That it's usually not one single drug treatment.
Okay. And then I guess this is sort of along the same lines, but is there anything you can tell us about current research on drug therapies for DMD patients, or how many years out do you think we are from any of these being available?
Well, I don't like to predict how far we're out. I mean, keep in mind that there is an approved drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's not in the United States. It's Translarna in Europe. And,
I just wrote a paper about it, but I thought that the FDA.
So they got a refuse to file letter from the FDA, and it's not clear what the cause for that, whether they can address the. But there's other things that are certainly going through clinical trials and will be submitted to the FDA probably, if not this year, but in the next couple of years. I don't think we can yet predict how it's going to go, but there's certainly a lot of really, really smart people doing some very clever and well-reasoned science. So, I think that, I'd have to say 10 years from now, there's definitely going to be a change in how Duchenne patients are treated, and I hope it's much sooner than that.
Yeah. And then I have, I guess, one more fun question, and then if you have anything else you want to add, just let me know. But I was just going to ask how you knew our professor, Dr. Crosby Watson.
Yeah. So when I was at NIAMS, she was one of my grantees. So I read her progress reports, and I probably talked to her about summary statements at different times.
Yeah.
And it's always a pleasure to see her at meetings, scientific meetings. And so she's really had a positive impact on the muscular dystrophy field, and she's at a good location with a lot of excellent researchers around her. I know Stan Nelson and Carrie Michelli and Melissa Spencer and Jim Tidball and others there at UCLA. It's a very strong place.
Yeah. And then do you have anything else you'd like to add, or there's a lot of good questions.
I don't know if part of this is to kind of so is your class primarily seniors?
It's pretty much all juniors and seniors. Most of us are physiology majors. There's a few like other majors, because UCLA's physiology program, we have a certain amount of operatives we have to take.
Yeah.
But the main goal of this assignment was not only to for us to learn more about DMD, but to be able to share it with our class and have it basically it just be able to inform more people in our class, and so that's the main goal of this assignment. So
So I would say that when you think about career directions, what I've learned is that if you get a good basic education in things like anatomy and physiology and cell biology and biochemistry, and there's a lot of different directions you can take that in.
Yeah.
I think many of you will take it into medical school, and then you have to make decisions about what types of medicine to practice. If you have the opportunity in medical school to go down the neurology route, I think in general the brain's a pretty impressive organ, and I think that the future of neurobiology and neuroscience and neurology clinical practice is going to be exciting. What I'm hoping is that as there are strategies for treating the muscular dystrophies become available that that then there'll be it'll be inviting for more pediatric neuromuscular specialists to come into the field because they can actually do something for their patients, and hopefully that will grow the field both research wise and also clinical practice wise, so that it really kind of decreases the impact of these diseases on people's families, and that's kind of what we're working towards.
All right, perfect. Thank you absolutely so
Sure.
much. I'll just press